Until a lone rancher fought back, an Apache woman was marked for death. The morning sun was already burning hot when Samuel Garrett walked out to check his cattle. He was a man who liked his routines. Every day was the same: feed the animals, mend the fences, avoid people. That's how he'd lived for the past 8 years since coming to Arizona Territory.
He didn't want friends. He didn't want conversation.
He just wanted to be left alone with his memories and his regrets. But that morning everything changed. As Garrett approached the well near the eastern edge of his property, he noticed something unusual. At first, he thought it was just a pile of old clothes someone had dumped. But as he got closer, his heart jumped. It was a person. A woman. Garrett's hand went instinctively to the rifle he always carried. Living out here, you learn to be careful. Trust could get you killed. But when he knelt down beside the collapsed figure, he saw she was barely breathing. Her Apache clothing was torn and stained with dried blood. Her face was covered in dust and scratches. She looked like she'd been running for days. His first thought was clear and simple. This wasn't his problem. Whoever this woman was, whatever trouble she was in, he didn't want any part of it. Garrett had spent years building walls around himself, keeping the world at a distance. He'd come west to escape pain, to forget. Getting involved with someone else's crisis was the last thing he needed. He stood up, ready to walk away. Maybe he'd send word to town. Let the marshal deal with it. That was the smart thing to do. But then the woman made a small sound, barely more than a whisper. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, filled with fear and pain, before closing again. In that brief instant, Garrett saw something that stopped him cold. He saw his daughter's eyes, the same look she'd had in those final days before the fever took her. Helpless. Afraid. Hoping someone would care enough to help, Garrett cursed under his breath. He knew he was making a mistake. But he couldn't just leave her there to die in the sun. Whatever else he'd become, bitter, isolated, broken, he wasn't that kind of man. Not yet. With considerable effort, he lifted the unconscious woman and carried her to his barn. She was lighter than he expected, probably hadn't eaten properly in days. He laid her on a pile of hay in the corner, far from the main doors, where she wouldn't be easily seen if anyone came by. Then he fetched water and clean rags. For the next hour, Garrett worked in silence, cleaning her wounds as best he could. There was a deep gash on her left arm that looked infected. Bruises covered her ribs. Her feet were torn and blistered from running. He brought her water, forcing small sips past her cracked lips. She remained unconscious through it all. When he finally finished, Garrett sat back and studied the woman. She was young, probably in her 20s. Even in this condition, there was something strong about her face. This wasn't someone who gave up easily. Whatever she was running from must be serious. He made a decision. 3 days. He'd give her 3 days to recover enough to move on. After that, she was on her own. He couldn't afford to get involved beyond that. The barn would hide her from casual visitors, and he rarely had those anyway. For the rest of that day, Garrett went about his work, but his mind kept drifting back to the woman in his barn. Who was she? What had happened to her? He told himself it didn't matter. It wasn't his business. The next morning, he brought food, simple bread and beans. The woman was awake, sitting up against the barn wall. Her dark eyes watched him with the wariness of a wild animal. She didn't speak. Neither did he. Garrett set the food down and left. This pattern continued for 2 days. He'd bring food and water. She'd watch him silently. Neither attempted conversation. Garrett preferred it that way. Talking led to connection, and connection led to caring, and he'd promised himself he wouldn't care about anyone ever again. On the 3rd day, Garrett rode into town for supplies. The small settlement of Copper Springs was just a collection of rough buildings along a dusty street, but it was where people gathered and where news traveled. As soon as he tied his horse outside the general store, he sensed something different. Men stood in small groups, talking in urgent, excited voices. Inside the store, Garrett heard the talk. An Apache woman was wanted. There was a bounty on her head, $50, a fortune for most men in these parts. The Indian agent, a man named Harlan Krebs, had put up the money himself. He claimed the woman had been involved in the recent wagon train attack, said she'd helped the raiders, then stolen important government documents. Krebs was organizing a hunting party to track her down. Garrett's stomach tightened. $50. That was serious money. Men would kill for less. He bought his supplies quickly and headed back to the ranch, his mind racing. The woman in his barn had to be the one they were talking about, which meant every bounty hunter and desperate man in the territory would be looking for her. And if anyone found out he was hiding her, he'd be in as much danger as she was. When he got back to the ranch, Garrett went straight to the barn. The woman was standing now, testing her injured leg. She tensed when she saw him, reading something in his expression. "You need to leave," Garrett said, his voice harder than he intended. "As soon as it's dark." She stared at him but said nothing. "There's men looking for you," he continued. "Bounty hunters. They'll kill you if they find you, and I can't have that trouble here." Still, she remained silent, but something flickered in her eyes. Not fear exactly. More like resignation. Like she'd expected this. Garrett turned to leave, but stopped at the barn door. "I'll give you some supplies. Food and water for a few days. But after tonight, you're not my problem anymore." That evening, Garrett prepared a pack for her. Dried meat, bread, a full canteen, a blanket. It was more than he needed to give, but his conscience demanded it. He'd saved her life. He didn't want her death on his hands a few days later. But before the woman could leave, Garrett heard something that made his blood run cold. Horses. Multiple riders approaching fast. He ran to the window and looked out. 6 men on horseback were riding toward his ranch house. Even in the fading light, he recognized the leader. Harlan Krebs, the Indian agent. The man sat tall in his saddle, dressed too fine for the territory, his face wearing an expression of cruel determination. Garrett's mind raced. They'd tracked her here somehow, maybe followed her blood trail days ago. Maybe someone in town had been suspicious of his sudden visit for supplies. It didn't matter how. They were here. He ran to the barn. The woman was already standing, alert, having heard the horses too. "Stay hidden," Garrett ordered. "Don't make a sound." He walked out to meet the riders, keeping his expression neutral, his hand near his gun. Krebs dismounted with an arrogant smile. "Ah, Mr. Garrett," Krebs said, his voice oily and false. "We're looking for a dangerous fugitive, an Apache woman. We have reason to believe she passed through this area." Garrett's face remained stone. "I haven't seen anyone." "You're certain?" Krebs' eyes narrowed. "We tracked her trail to your property line, ended right around your well." "Lots of people pass through," Garrett said calmly. "Animals, too." "Tracks don't mean much in this sand," one of the other men, a rough-looking bounty hunter, spat tobacco juice on the ground. "Mind if we look around?" "Yes, I do mind," Garrett said, his voice hard as iron. "This is my property. You've got no warrant and no right." Krebs' smile disappeared. "We could make this difficult for you, Mr. Garrett." "You could try?" Garrett replied, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "But I was a sharpshooter in the war. Lost a lot since then, but not my aim. First man who steps toward my barn without permission won't step anywhere again." The tension stretched tight as a wire. The bounty hunters measured Garrett with their eyes, calculating whether the reward was worth the risk. Krebs' face reddened with anger, but he was smart enough to recognize a man who'd follow through on his threat. "We'll be watching this ranch," Krebs finally said, climbing back on his horse. "If we find out you're lying, you'll hang alongside that Apache woman." Garrett said nothing, just watched as the men rode off into the gathering darkness. But his heart was pounding. He'd just made a choice, and there was no going back now. He'd lied to protect her. That made him complicit. That made him a target too. When he returned to the barn, the woman was waiting. For the first time, she spoke, her English halting but clear. "Why?" she asked simply. Garrett didn't have a good answer. He didn't know why himself. Maybe it was the look in Krebs' eyes, the eager cruelty that reminded him of men he'd hated during the war. Maybe it was because he recognized injustice when he saw it. Or maybe deep down he was tired of running from everything that required courage. "I don't know," he admitted. "But they'll be back, and next time they won't ask permission." The night passed slowly. Garrett didn't sleep. He sat in his house with his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness outside his windows, listening for the sound of approaching horses. The woman, he still didn't know her name, remained hidden in the barn. Every hour he'd walk out to check on her, bringing water, saying nothing. As dawn broke across the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Garrett knew they were running out of time. Krebs wasn't the type of man to give up. He had too much pride, too much at stake. Those men would return, and when they did, there would be blood. Around mid-morning, Garrett made a decision. He walked to the barn where the woman sat alert, her dark eyes tracking his every movement. She'd found an old knife in the barn and held it ready, not threatening him, but prepared. Survival had made her cautious. "I need the truth," Garrett said, sitting down on a wooden crate across from her. "That man yesterday, Krebs, he said you stole government documents. He said you were involved in an attack. I need to know what really happened. The woman studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he could be trusted. Finally, she spoke, her words careful and measured in her accented English. "My name is Nalin," she began. "I work as translator, help Apache people talk with white officials. I'd see many things. Bad things." She paused, gathering her thoughts, choosing words she knew in English. Krebs is Indian agent. He's supposed to bring food, blankets, medicine to reservation. But he sell these things. Keep money for himself. Apache people starve while he gets rich. I see him. I see the papers he write. False numbers. Lies. Garrett listened, his jaw tightening. He'd heard stories of corrupt Indian agents before. It was a common enough problem throughout the territories. Men given power over desperate people with little oversight often took advantage. "I copy his papers," Nayland continued. "Write down numbers, names. I think maybe I take to Marshall in Tucson. Show proof. Maybe someone help Apache people." "But he found out," Garrett said. Nayland nodded. "He come to my home, angry, dangerous, say he will kill me, make it look like accident. I run, hide papers in canyon 3 miles north, in rocks. Then I keep running. He tell everyone I help attack wagon train, make me criminal. Now everyone hunt me." The pieces fell into place in Garrett's mind. This wasn't about justice. This was about a corrupt man protecting his crimes. Nayland wasn't a criminal. She was a witness, and Krebs would do anything to silence her. "These papers you hid," Garrett said slowly, "they could prove what he's done?" "Yes. Names of men he sell to. How much money?" "Everything." Garrett stood up and paced the barn, thinking hard. If they could get those documents to the territorial marshal, Nayland's name could be cleared. But Tucson was 3 days' hard ride away, and Krebs had men watching the roads. They'd never make it. Before he could speak, a sound made both of them freeze. Horses again. Many horses this time. Garrett moved quickly to the barn door and peered through a gap in the wood. His heart sank. At least a dozen men surrounded his property. Krebs sat on his horse in front, but now he'd brought serious reinforcements. Bounty hunters, rough men desperate for money, and even a few local ranchers who believed Krebs' lies about the wagon train attack. "Garrett," Krebs called out, his voice carrying across the dusty yard. "We know she's here. We've found fresh tracks. Woman's tracks leading to your barn. Send her out, and we'll leave you be. Keep protecting her, and you'll burn with her." Garrett's mind raced. He couldn't fight this many men. Even with his war experience, the numbers were impossible. But he couldn't hand Nayland over either. He'd seen the look in Krebs's eyes. The man wouldn't take her to trial. She'd be dead before sunset. "Give me 10 minutes, Garrett shouted back. "Let me think." "You've got 5? Krebs replied. Garrett rushed back into the barn. Nayland stood ready, the knife in her hand, but they both knew a knife wouldn't help against a dozen guns. "There's too many," Garrett said. "We can't fight them straight on, but my ranch backs up to rocky terrain. If we can get to the canyon lands, we might lose them in the rocks. It's rough country. Their horses won't handle it well." "And then?" Nalin asked. "Then we get those papers you hid. We run for Tucson. It's our only chance." It was a desperate plan. The odds of success were slim, but staying meant certain death. Garrett moved quickly. He gathered supplies, food, water, ammunition, blankets. He saddled his 2 horses, knowing they'd need to ride them hard and fast. Nalin helped, moving with quiet efficiency despite her injuries. "When I give the signal," Garrett whispered, "we ride straight east through the back of the barn. There's a door on the far side they can't see from where they're positioned. We'll have maybe 30 seconds before they realize what's happening." Nalin nodded, understanding. Garrett walked to the front of the barn one last time, peering through the gap. Krebs was getting impatient, barking orders to his men. Some of them had dismounted and were moving closer to the buildings. It was now or never. Garrett grabbed a lantern and some oil. He poured the oil across a pile of old hay near the front entrance, then struck a match. The hay caught immediately, flames licking upward. Black smoke began pouring out of the barn's front entrance. "Fire!" someone outside shouted. In the confusion, as men rushed forward thinking the barn was accidentally burning, Garrett and Nayland mounted their horses and burst through the back door at full gallop. The sudden appearance caught everyone by surprise. By the time Krebs realized what was happening and screamed orders to pursue, Garrett and Nalin had a crucial head start. They rode hard across Garrett's property, jumping a low fence and heading straight for the rough country beyond. Behind them, angry shouts filled the air, followed by gunshots. Bullets whizzed past, but shooting accurately from horseback was nearly impossible. The terrain quickly became Garrett's ally. Rocky outcroppings and steep gullies made pursuit difficult. He knew this land, had spent years wandering it alone. He guided them through paths that horses could barely navigate, places where riders had to dismount and lead their animals carefully. But Krebs's men were determined. The bounty was too good to abandon. They kept coming, spreading out to cut off escape routes, firing whenever they got close enough. As the sun climbed higher, the desert heat became brutal. Both Garrett and Nowlin pushed their horses to the limit, knowing that stopping meant death. Sweat poured down their faces. Their water was already running low. By afternoon, they'd managed to create some distance between themselves and their pursuers, but they hadn't lost them completely. Dust clouds in the distance marked where Krebs's men continued the hunt. Garrett led them deeper into the canyon lands, toward where Nayland said she'd hidden the documents. The landscape was harsh and beautiful, red rock formations jutting toward the sky, narrow passages between towering stone walls, ancient petroglyphs marking places where people had lived centuries before. They finally stopped in a narrow canyon to rest the horses. Both animals were exhausted, foam on their mouths, sides heaving. Garrett's shoulder ached where he'd injured it years ago in the war. Nayland's wounds from her earlier ordeal had reopened, fresh blood staining her clothing. "How much further to where you hid the papers?" Garrett asked, breathing hard. "Maybe 1 mile, Nayland said, pointing toward a distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant. "There, in caves below that rock." A gunshot echoed through the canyon, the sound bouncing off walls making it impossible to tell which direction it came from. Then another. Their pursuers were closer than Garrett had hoped. "We have to move," he said. "We'll leave the horses. We'll go on foot. Quieter that way." They quickly grabbed what supplies they could carry and began climbing toward the rock formation. The path was steep and treacherous. Loose rocks skittered beneath their feet. One wrong step could mean a fatal fall. Halfway up, Garrett heard voices below. He pulled Nolin behind a boulder, and they watched as 3 of Krebs' men entered the canyon on horseback, looking around carefully. The men hadn't spotted them yet, but they would soon. Time seemed to slow down. Garrett felt his heart pounding in his chest. He'd spent years avoiding exactly this kind of situation. Violence, danger, caring enough about something to risk his life. But here he was, crouched behind a rock with a woman he barely knew, running from men who wanted them both dead. One of the men below looked up, scanning the rocks. His eyes passed right over their hiding spot, then moved on. After what felt like an eternity, the 3 riders moved deeper into the canyon, away from Garrett and Nolin's position. They continued climbing. The sun was merciless, beating down on them without shade. Garrett's mouth felt like sandpaper. He took a small sip from his canteen and passed it to Nayland. She drank sparingly, knowing they had to make it last. Finally, they reached the cave entrance Nalin had described. It was a dark opening in the rock face, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Nolin entered first, Garrett following close behind. Inside, the temperature dropped immediately. The cave was cool and dark, a welcome relief from the burning sun. Nolin moved confidently through the darkness, having been here before. She led Garrett deeper into the cave system until they reached a small chamber. There, wedged behind a rock, was a waterproof leather pouch. Nowlin pulled it out with shaking hands and opened it. Inside were papers covered in handwriting. Names, dates, amounts of money, records of sales, everything needed to prove Krebs's corruption. "This is it," she whispered. Garrett took the pouch and examined the documents. Even in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance, he could see they were damning evidence. Lists of supplies that were supposed to go to the reservation but were sold to outlaws and corrupt merchants instead. Krebs had been stealing for years, growing rich while people starved. A sound from outside the cave made them both freeze. Footsteps. Someone had followed them. Garrett pressed himself against the cave wall, his hand on his gun. Nolin stood beside him, barely breathing, the precious pouch of documents clutched to her chest. The footsteps outside grew louder, more deliberate. Whoever was out there knew exactly where they were. A shadow appeared at the cave entrance, blocking the sunlight. Garrett's finger moved to the trigger, ready to defend their lives and the evidence they'd risked everything to retrieve. "Don't shoot, Garrett," a familiar voice called out. But it wasn't Krebs. It was younger, uncertain. "It's me, Private Daniel Cooper from Fort Benson." Garrett didn't lower his gun. "Step where I can see you." Slowly, a young soldier, barely 20 years old, moved into the dim light of the cave. His hands were raised, showing he meant no threat. His uniform was dusty from hard riding, and his face showed exhaustion and something else. "Conflict. How did you find us?" Garrett demanded. "I followed Krebs' hunting party," Cooper said, his voice shaking slightly. "But I'm not with them. Not anymore. I need to talk to you." Garrett studied the young man's face. looking for deception, finding only earnest worry. Talk fast. Cooper glanced at Nayland, then back to Garrett. 3 days ago, I was part of the group Krebs assembled. He said we were hunting a dangerous criminal. Said she'd helped murder innocent people. But something didn't feel right. Krebs was too eager, too angry. He wasn't acting like a lawman seeking justice. He was acting like a man afraid. The soldier paused, gathering his thoughts. Yesterday, I heard him talking with one of the bounty hunters when they thought no one was listening. Krebs said once they found the woman, there couldn't be a trial. Said she knew too much and had to disappear completely. That's when I knew something was very wrong. Garrett slowly lowered his gun. So what are you doing here? I rode back to Fort Benson last night and spoke with Captain Morrison. Told him everything I'd seen and heard. The captain's been suspicious of Krebs for months. There have been complaints from the reservation about missing supplies, but no proof. When I told him about this hunt, about how desperate Krebs seemed, Morrison started investigating. Cooper reached into his jacket carefully, pulling out a folded paper. The captain sent me to find you with this. It's an official order for Krebs' arrest, pending investigation. But I need that evidence you're carrying to make it stick. Nayland looked at Garrett questioningly. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes. They'd been running for so long, trusting no one. Was this young soldier telling the truth, or was it an elaborate trap? How do we know you're not working for Krebs? Garrett asked. You don't, Cooper admitted honestly. But think about it. If I was with Krebs, I'd have brought the whole hunting party with me. I'm here alone, unarmed, except for my service pistol, which I haven't drawn, and I'm telling you that Captain Morrison and a full cavalry detachment are riding this way right now. They should arrive within the hour. Garrett exchanged a long look with Nayland. It was a risk. Everything was a risk at this point, but something in the young soldier's face reminded Garrett of men he'd served with during the war. Honest men trying to do the right thing in complicated situations. Before Garrett could respond, gunfire erupted outside the cave. The sharp crack of rifles echoed through the canyon, followed by shouting voices. They found us! Cooper yelled, pulling his pistol and moving to the cave entrance. Garrett grabbed Nayland's arm and pulled her deeper into the cave. Is there another way out of here? She shook her head. Only one entrance. They were trapped. Garrett moved to the cave opening beside Cooper and peered out. 6 men were positioned in the rocks below, using boulders for cover. Krebs stood behind them, his expensive clothes now covered in dust, his face twisted with fury. This is over, Garrett, Krebs shouted. Send out the woman and the documents, and I'll let you live. He's lying, Cooper whispered. He can't leave witnesses now. Garrett knew the soldier was right. Krebs had gone too far. He'd organized an illegal hunt, tried to murder a witness, and now he was cornered. Desperate men did desperate things. We need to buy time, Garrett said. If Morrison is really coming, we just need to hold out. How long? Nayland asked from deeper in the cave. Could be 20 minutes, could be an hour, Cooper answered. Depends on how fast they rode. Another volley of gunfire struck the rocks around the cave entrance. Krebs' men were testing their defenses, seeing if anyone would return fire. Garrett fired 2 careful shots, not trying to hit anyone, but showing they were armed and ready to fight. The shooting continued sporadically for the next several minutes. Krebs' men were in no hurry. They had Garrett's group pinned down with nowhere to run. Time was on their side, or so they thought. Inside the cave, Garrett checked his ammunition. He had maybe 20 rounds left. Cooper had less. It wasn't enough for a prolonged fight. I'm sorry, Nayland said quietly from the shadows. This is my fault. You should not have helped me. Garrett looked back at her. In the dim light, he could see the guilt and sadness in her face. This woman had only tried to do the right thing, to expose corruption and help her people, and it had cost her everything. I made my own choice, Garrett said firmly. First real choice I've made in 8 years. Not sorry about it. Something changed in Nayland's expression. A small light of hope, or perhaps respect. More gunfire erupted, closer this time. Krebs' men were advancing, using the cover of rocks to move up the canyon wall. They'd be at the cave entrance in minutes. Cooper fired 3 quick shots, forcing the attackers back temporarily. We can't hold this position much longer. Then, like a gift from heaven, Garrett heard something beautiful. A bugle call. The clear, sharp notes of cavalry charge echoing through the canyon. Krebs heard it too. Garrett could see the panic flash across the man's face as he spun around, looking toward the canyon entrance. Mounted soldiers poured into the canyon, at least 20 of them, led by an officer whose uniform marked him as a captain. Captain Morrison had arrived, and he brought enough men to end this fight decisively. Drop your weapons, Morrison's voice boomed through the canyon. "This is the United States Cavalry. You are ordered to surrender immediately." For a moment, nobody moved. Krebs' hired men looked at each other, calculating their options. The bounty had seemed worth the risk when they were just hunting one woman. But facing trained cavalry soldiers was a different matter entirely. One by one, the bounty hunters dropped their guns and raised their hands. They were criminals, but they weren't stupid enough to fight the army. Only Krebs remained defiant. He pulled his own pistol and pointed it not at the soldiers, but at the cave entrance where Garrett, Naleen, and Cooper stood. "She has to die!" Krebs screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's got papers that will ruin me. I won't let some Apache woman destroy everything I've built." "Put down the gun, Krebs," Morrison commanded, his voice steady and authoritative. "It's over." But Krebs wasn't listening anymore. Years of corruption, greed, and power had pushed him beyond reason. He raised his pistol higher, aiming at the cave. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, one from Captain Morrison's rifle, one from Garrett's pistol. Both found their target. Krebs fell backward, his gun dropping from his hand, clutching his shoulder and leg where the bullets had struck. Morrison had aimed to wound, not kill. So had Garrett. Soldiers rushed forward, securing Krebs and the other prisoners. Morrison dismounted and approached the cave entrance, where Garrett, Naleen, and Cooper slowly emerged into the sunlight. "Private Cooper," Morrison said, nodding to the young soldier. "Good work getting word to us." "Thank you, sir." Morrison turned his attention to Naleen. "Ma'am, I apologize for what you've been through. We've been investigating Agent Krebs for some time, but we needed evidence. Private Cooper tells me you have documents that prove his crimes?" Naleen held out the leather pouch wordlessly. Morrison took it and began examining the papers inside. His expression grew darker with each page he read. "This is enough to put him away for 20 years, Morrison said quietly. "Names, dates, amounts. He stole thousands of dollars meant for people who were starving." He looked at Naleen with respect. "You risked your life to gather this evidence. That took courage." "Will she be cleared of the charges?" Garrett asked. "There were never any real charges," Morrison replied. "Just lies from a desperate man. Miss Naleen is free to go wherever she wishes. In fact, the territorial government will probably want her testimony when this goes to trial." The tension that had gripped Garrett for days finally began to ease. They'd made it. Against impossible odds, they'd survived. Over the next hour, the soldiers secured all the prisoners and prepared to transport them back to Fort Benson. Krebs, wounded but alive, said nothing, his face pale with the realization that his crimes had finally caught up with him. Captain Morrison provided Garrett and Naleen with fresh horses and supplies for their journey back to the ranch. Before they left, Morrison pulled Garrett aside. "What you did was dangerous and technically illegal," the captain said quietly. "Harboring a fugitive, even a falsely accused one, could have gotten you hanged." "I know," Garrett replied. "But it was also the right thing to do," Morrison continued. "And it helped us catch a man who's been stealing from desperate people for years. The Army won't forget that." Garrett nodded, unsure what to say. The ride back to Broken Creek Ranch took most of the day. Garrett and Naleen rode in comfortable silence, both exhausted from their ordeal.